In 1922, a British archaeologist knelt in the dust of southern Iraq and pulled a dagger from a grave sealed shut for 4,500 years. The blade was bronze, and not crude bronze. The mixture inside it was so precise that modern metallurgists still use nearly the same ratio today. No thermometers, no chemistry labs, no written science as we know it. So how did a civilization 4,500 years old get the formula this exact? Was it accident, or was it knowledge we have since forgotten? This is the story of its buried kings, and a puzzle hidden inside bronze. Southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nasiriyah, sits a mound of earth that was once one of the most powerful cities on the planet. The Sumerians called it Between 1922 and 1934, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley led one of the largest excavations of his era there, directing hundreds of local workers through more than a decade of careful digging under the punishing desert sun. What his team found beneath that mound reshaped how historians understood the ancient world. Deep in the earth, Woolley's excavation broke into what became known as the Royal Cemetery of dozens of tombs holding kings, queens, and rows of attendants buried alongside them, surrounded by staggering wealth, gold headdresses, lyres inlaid with lapis lazuli, jewelry, chariots, and ceremonial objects packed into chamber after chamber. Among all of it were weapons, daggers, axe heads, spear points, all cast in bronze. When later researchers finally examined the metal itself, closely and scientifically, they were caught off guard. This wasn't rough, inconsistent metal, the kind you'd expect from early trial and error casting. The composition was tight, deliberate, and strikingly close to what modern industrial standards consider an ideal blend. That single detail turned a routine metallurgical footnote into a genuine puzzle. How did people living 45 centuries ago achieve this level of consistency, generation after generation, without any of the instruments we rely on today? Woolley himself, writing about the excavation years later, described the tombs as unlike anything he had encountered in his previous digs across the Middle East, filled with a density of finely crafted material that suggested organized, specialized production rather than scattered individual effort. The weapons in particular stood out, not simply for their decoration, but for how uniformly well-made they were across dozens of separate burials, spanning what appears to be multiple generations of Sumerian kings and queens. That consistency across time, not just within a single tomb, is part of what convinced later researchers this was a mastered craft, not a single lucky batch. To understand why that puzzle matters, you first need to understand what bronze actually is. It isn't a metal you simply dig out of the ground and shape. Bronze is an alloy, a deliberate combination, primarily of copper and tin. On its own, copper is soft. It bends under pressure, dulls quickly, and makes for a poor weapon or cutting edge. But introduce tin into molten copper, in the right quantity, and the resulting metal transforms, harder, more durable, far more resistant to corrosion over time. When scientists analyzed the objects recovered from they found a ratio close to 90% copper to 10% tin, a blend metallurgists sometimes nickname the golden ratio of bronze, because it produces close to an optimal balance between hardness and workability. That number isn't intuitive or easy to stumble onto. Add too little tin, and you've barely improved on plain copper. Add too much, and the alloy turns brittle, prone to shattering under stress rather than bending. Laboratories comparing the samples against modern industrial alloy specifications found the match remarkably close, closer than pure luck should reasonably allow. So the question researchers keep circling back to is this: was this ratio discovered by centuries of accidental trial and error, refined slowly by chance? Or does it reflect something closer to intentional, repeatable precision engineering, understood and protected by the smiths who used it? There's also a practical dimension worth noting. Bronze at roughly this ratio melts at a lower temperature than pure copper, which would have made it genuinely easier to cast using the furnace technology available at the time, and it also resists rust and corrosion far better than iron would centuries later. That combination of easier casting, tighter hardness, and long-term durability is exactly why bronze objects from Ur have survived in remarkably good condition for 4,500 years, letting modern labs analyze them almost as if they were freshly forged. Here's where the story gets stranger. Tin, the essential second ingredient, does not occur naturally anywhere near Mesopotamia, not in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, not in the surrounding hills, not anywhere within easy reach. Geological surveys of the region confirm there were no local tin deposits the Sumerians could have simply mined nearby. So where did it come from? Reconstructed trade routes, built from decades of archaeological and geological research, point towards sources as distant as the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, and possibly other regions further east. That means raw tin ore was being transported over distances exceeding 1,000 kilometers, crossing mountain ranges, stretches of desert, and the territory of multiple independent peoples, just to reach the metal workshops of Ur. That kind of distance doesn't happen informally. Someone had to organize it, arranging caravans, negotiating terms with distant communities, tracking shipments across months or years, and absorbing the very real risk of loss along the way. And remarkably, physical evidence of exactly this kind of organization survives. Clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites record trade agreements, shipment disputes, and correspondence about metal deliveries. Solid proof that a long-distance tin supply chain wasn't improvised on the fly, but managed through real administrative structure, contracts, and accountability. Some of these records even list specific merchants by name, along with the quantities owed and penalties for late or short deliveries, suggesting a level of commercial law surrounding metal trade that most people don't associate with a civilization this old. Controlling that supply chain would have meant real economic and political power, since whoever controlled the flow of tin into Ur effectively controlled the city's ability to arm itself and to produce the luxury goods buried alongside its kings. Those clay tablets are written in cuneiform, one of the oldest writing systems ever discovered, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay using a cut reed stylus. Scholars have spent well over a century learning to decode them, and among the surviving texts are letters sent directly from merchants to working metalsmiths. Some describe the required purity of an ordered batch of metal in specific terms. Others contain symbols that appear to represent standardized units of measurement, an early form of quality control built directly into commercial correspondence. This raises a genuinely tantalizing question historians still argue over. Was there some kind of guarded formula, a fixed ratio passed down carefully among trusted smiths, something close to what we would now call a trade secret? The tablets themselves don't offer a clean, definitive answer. Ancient technical vocabulary is notoriously difficult to translate with certainty, since many of the specialized terms lack any modern equivalent, and the scribes who wrote them were writing for people who already understood the process intimately, not for outsiders trying to reconstruct it thousands of years later. But the sheer fact that purity and quality were being tracked, recorded, and disputed in writing tells us this was never pure guesswork. It was a controlled, documented craft. Some tablets even record complaints, merchants writing back to suppliers to say a delivered batch of metal was impure or below the agreed standard, demanding replacement or compensation. That kind of written quality dispute, thousands of years before any modern industrial standard existed, tells us Sumerian society had already developed a working concept of consistent, testable material quality, even without the scientific vocabulary to describe why it mattered chemically. The people who actually cast this bronze held a distinct place in Sumerian society. Metalworkers in Ur were not ordinary laborers. They occupied a respected position closer to skilled specialists, sometimes standing near the upper tiers of craft hierarchy. Becoming one required years of formal apprenticeship, training under a master smith who guarded hard-won techniques carefully and passed them down selectively. These craftsmen had to master something extraordinarily difficult without any modern instruments: precise, Sustained temperature control. Melting copper and tin into a workable alloy demands consistent, very high heat, sustained for extended periods. Sumerian smiths achieved this using bellows, devices that forced air into furnaces to intensify combustion, allowing them to reach and hold the exact melting point required. Once molten, metal was frequently shaped using a technique called lost wax casting, where a detailed wax model gets encased in clay, then melted out and replaced by liquid metal, allowing for intricate, precise shapes that hammering alone could never achieve. After casting, smiths often strengthened finished pieces, further through work hardening, hammering the cooled metal to increase its density and edge strength. And these workshops didn't operate in isolation from each other. Rival cities and rival smiths competed openly, and a craftsman's reputation and livelihood depended entirely on the consistent quality leaving his forge. Apprentices reportedly spent years simply learning to judge molten metal by color and behavior alone, since there was no thermometer to consult, only the practiced eye of a master who had watched thousands of pours before ever letting a student attempt one independently. That kind of embodied, hands-on expertise, refined and tested across an entire working lifetime, is very likely a large part of the answer to how such consistent ratios were achieved without any formal chemistry at all. So does the ancient bronze from genuinely hold up against modern engineering standards? Researchers have run these artifacts through X-ray fluorescence analysis, a non-destructive technique that reveals the exact elemental composition of a metal object without damaging or altering it in any way. The results, published by metallurgists working directly alongside archaeological teams, showed compositions consistently falling within ranges still referenced in modern alloy classification systems used in engineering today. Not every recovered object was identical in composition. Ceremonial pieces and everyday utilitarian tools sometimes carried noticeably different ratios, suggesting smiths deliberately adjusted their mix depending on an object's purpose, whether it was meant to be decorative and symbolic, or functional and built to withstand real combat use. Weapons in particular tended to carry a higher proportion of tin, improving hardness for cutting and thrusting. The engineering conclusion many specialists have settled on is fairly direct. This consistency wasn't random accident repeated by luck. But that conclusion only deepens the next question. If Sumerian bronze working reached this level of refinement, why does the quality of bronze artifacts appear to decline in certain later periods, and in some regions of the ancient world, seem to vanish from the archaeological record almost entirely? Researchers comparing tools versus weapons found another pattern worth noting. Everyday utilitarian items, like sickles and chisels, sometimes used a slightly different alloy mix than ceremonial or military pieces, implying smiths understood that different jobs called for different balances of hardness and flexibility, essentially an early, practical form of materials selection matched to intended use. Bronze in Sumerian society was never treated as a purely practical, utilitarian material. It carried genuine religious weight. Numerous tablets and carved reliefs suggest bronze was viewed as connected to divine power, a substance transformed by forces that ordinary people considered close to sacred. Metalworkers themselves were sometimes regarded as holding a special relationship with the gods, since turning raw, dull ore into gleaming, hardened, useful metal must have looked almost supernatural to observers who had no concept of the underlying chemistry at work. Rituals reportedly accompanied the casting process itself, with chants or prayers recited while furnaces burned, meant to bless the molten metal and guarantee its strength before it ever cooled. Finished bronze objects were also formally offered inside temples, the towering stepped structures known as ziggurats, presented as gifts to patron deities overseeing the city. Whether that spiritual dimension actually improved the technical quality of the finished craftsmanship is impossible to prove definitively, but it tells us something important nonetheless. This was never treated as ordinary industry. It was sacred, closely guarded work, wrapped in tradition, and likely shielded from curious outsiders. Symbols engraved on several recovered weapons remain fully undeciphered to this day. their original meaning lost, along with whatever cultural context once explained them clearly. Some historians argue this sacred framing may have actually served a very practical purpose. By wrapping metalworking knowledge in ritual and religious authority, Sumerian society gave smiths a strong cultural incentive to guard their techniques carefully and to pass them down only within trusted, approved lines of apprenticeship, effectively protecting valuable trade knowledge behind a wall of spiritual reverence rather than any written patent or formal law. Every long, fragile supply chain eventually reaches a breaking point, and Ur's distant tin route was no exception to that rule. As centuries passed, mounting evidence points to real disruptions across that 1,000-kilometer network. Open conflicts between rival city-states, shifting political alliances, and growing instability along the very routes tin needed to travel to reach workshops in Mesopotamia at all. Later period bronze artifacts recovered from the region show a measurable, documented decline in quality compared to earlier pieces from the royal cemetery, with less consistent copper-to-tin ratios and noticeably higher impurity levels. Archaeologists have also uncovered clear evidence that older, existing bronze objects were being deliberately melted down and recast into new items, a strong sign that raw tin had grown scarce enough that recycling became genuinely necessary just to keep local production running at all. This scarcity had real, tangible consequences beyond craftsmanship. A weakened, unreliable bronze supply meant weaker weapons reaching Sumerian armies at precisely the moments when political tension between competing cities was rising sharply. It's a pattern worth sitting with carefully. An entire advanced civilization's military strength was ultimately tied to a critical resource it could never produce locally, and had to protect entirely through diplomacy and fragile trade rather than geography or self-sufficiency. Some historians point to this exact vulnerability as an early cautionary tale, one that echoes surprisingly well into the modern world, where entire industries can still depend on a handful of distant sources for a single critical raw material, and where a single disrupted trade route, thousands of kilometers away, can quietly weaken a society's capability at home, long before anyone fully understands why. Modern experts remain genuinely divided on several parts of this story even now. Historians working at institutions across the United Kingdom and Germany have published competing interpretations of exactly how deliberate the bronze formula truly was, and ongoing debates between archaeologists and professional metallurgists continue over how much of this precision reflects slowly accumulated practical experience versus a deeper, more theoretical understanding of materials. Over the years, a handful of fringe voices have floated far wilder explanations, even suggesting some kind of outside intervention was somehow involved in the alloy's precision, a claim that serious, credentialed researchers dismiss outright, since the archaeological and textual evidence lines up consistently with gradual human skill development, structured generational apprenticeship, and trial and error refinement carried out across centuries, not any sudden, unexplained technological leap. What's genuinely more interesting than any outside explanation is what all of this reveals about the people themselves. Ancient Sumerians were solving real material science problems through patient observation, repeated experimentation, and carefully inherited craft knowledge, all without the benefit of any theoretical chemistry we take entirely for granted now. That isn't a mystery that requires aliens or lost technology to explain. That's simply a powerful testament to human ingenuity operating under real constraints. Researchers studying this period increasingly emphasize how much value this kind of study holds for the present, since understanding how an ancient society without modern science managed complex logistics, quality control, and skilled craft transmission offers genuine lessons about resilience, knowledge sharing, and adaptation that remain relevant well beyond archaeology departments. What emerged from beneath the sand at is far more than just a collection of ancient weapons sitting in glass cases. It's a genuine bridge, connecting a world we can barely imagine to the one we actually live in now. Solid proof that precision, quality control, and coordinated long-distance logistics existed thousands of years before anyone ever wrote down the word engineering. Much of what we know today survives purely because institutions like the British Museum and the Iraq Museum have carefully preserved these fragile bronze objects, along with the clay tablets that traveled alongside them, allowing new generations of researchers to keep returning and re-examining what earlier archaeologists could once only guess at from a distance. So do we actually understand it all by now, fully and completely? Not even close. There are tablets still waiting to be translated, symbols still fully undeciphered, casting techniques still actively debated among specialists. Every year, fresh laboratory analysis adds another layer onto this story, and each new layer seems to raise just as many fresh questions as it manages to answer with confidence. Maybe that's the real, lasting legacy of Ur's bronze after all. Not a fully solved mystery locked safely in the past, but a standing invitation to keep digging, keep asking sharper questions, and keep marveling at exactly how far human ingenuity reached, even in the earliest, most fragile chapters of civilization itself. Every dagger, every axe head, every quiet clay tablet still sitting in a museum drawer somewhere is really just another small piece of that same enduring puzzle, waiting patiently for the next researcher, curious enough to look closely and ask what else this ancient bronze might still be able to tell us.